It's interesting to me how places can be quite a lot like music in the way that you can associate places very intensely at times with feelings and people, and that it could just be very deeply embedded in you. I've been talking in this series of videos about moving someplace better, aspiring to do that, thinking you're doing that, failing to do that, and persisting to do that. And I've been telling you about my move to South Beach and how I thought that this was supposed to be that, moving someplace better at one point in my life. And I've been talking to you about how really it ended up being quite a awfully nihilistic and depressing experience. It just so happens that there are things that are sometimes not fun to talk about, not things we're not proud of, memories that perhaps sometimes we wish we could just burn them and watch them disintegrate. On the other hand, there is something about memory and your life story, isn't there? The fact that this did happen, the fact that this is the truth of your evolution. I think I've talked about this before, but as we reflect, for example, on America's past, and we think about the fact that there are things that are awful that have been done in the name of the American government and the American people, and that it hurts to reflect on them, and it hurts to acknowledge them, and it would feel better if in fact we could just pretend certain things never happened, how we treated the Native Americans and the African Americans and women and homosexuals and lesbians, etc. I mean, just being some of the prime examples, right? But it wouldn't be the right thing to do, to lie about the story and not understand the pursuit of trying to become better and doing the right thing. So it is with that complex feeling that I do reflect on South Beach as something, my time in South Beach as something, I mean, it's not pleasant to recall. It's, the best way I could describe it to you is it's, as I remember it, that's not to say it was 100% bad memories, but as I remember it, the mind isn't a perfect thing. It tends to play out like a nightmare. In fact, I've had a string of various recurring nightmares about experiences in South Beach, or memories of going back to South Beach in these dreams. Often the theme is the girlfriend I had at the time. Usually it takes place in the condo where she lived, and usually there's the experience of her mother despising me and like facializing her hatred for me, sometimes articulating it explicitly. And the awful feeling in the dream is always this intensity of shame and incompetence and just like awfulness. That's the only way I can experience it, just this awfulness. The irony is, to the best of my memory, this girl's mother actually, I don't think, would be the kind of person to really want someone to drown in shame. However, it is the case that she shows up in my dreams, often bombarding me with it. That's just how things go. This is going to be an interesting angle that I take today. It's a more artistic theme here because two things. Number one, it so happens that there are two songs that, for whatever reason, really capture an essence of how I thought or felt during the majority of my time in South Beach and what I come to associate it with. And also there's the fact that, keeping in mind part of my reason for being in South Beach, as opposed to, say, like going back to college, was that I was I believed, living the dream of the starving artist. I was just a poet hanging out and writing poetry, and that was that, and that was the right thing to do, I thought. And those are the two perspectives I'm going to look at today and sort of examine how they influence the conception, if you will. So this is also then, in that sense, sort of a very psychological episode here. I think that it's important to see this whole series is really one based on the self and autobiography, memoir, introspection, and how we see a relationship between experiences and the meaning we take from those experiences and what those philosophical implications are. I believe that all of that is relevant to philosophy, absolutely. It's interesting, actually, as I reflect back and I think about how important people's lives have always been to me, how much I've always loved reading memoirs and autobiographies, or poetry which reads more like a personal essay, or personal essays which either are very personal in their approach to philosophy, or are autobiographical. It's because, to me, at the end of the day, it's all about life and what we take from it as life continues, and we try to make ourselves better people. And not only is there the thing about us trying to learn from our past, but there is the fact that our memories do often remain with us. They bask in us sometimes, and we are left with them, and so we must do something with them. So I think we must almost need to try and I think combat any kind of negativity that they make us feel by trying to plunge into it and go, I guess, deeper and deeper in search of meaning, perhaps. Anyway, so I want to start this by this is interesting, how just the way we associate things with things. So later, much later in life, during my phase in East Windsor, upon returning to college, actually, at that time, and I was working at Bottle King, which was a liquor store, and the radio would play while I worked on the cash register, and it was usually music from the last 10, 20 years, I guess, and the song Demons by Imagine Dragons would play, and I never caught the lyrics when I would hear it, but I would catch the melody of the song, and the melody always haunted me, and I don't know why, but it went right into my soul, and it cut, and for whatever reason it would inject these memories of South Beach, my time in South Beach, and like all of this pain and memories of being a bad, belligerent boyfriend, if you will, and memories of the girlfriend I had, of her sadness, her pain, her disappointment, or the I guess the unfairness or misfortune that was perpetrated as a result of that, and just this strange sort of like nihilistic trap that it felt like the whole situation was in, like it was something that I couldn't think through. Anyway, I did want to share some of the lyrics with you, and if you check out the notes section in the blog section of the vlog, I will of course I will also give you the lyrics there, and I'll share with you, embed the song. I do love my coffee. He sings, "When you feel the heat, look into my eyes. It's where my demons hide. It's where my demons hide. Don't get too close. It's dark inside. It's where my demons hide. It's where my demons hide. That's one little snippet. I'll share a little bit more in a bit. But that's certainly how I felt in that. I mean, I don't believe in demons per se, right? But if we take a sort of figurative sense of what we associate with demons, right? Dark thoughts, treacherous thoughts. I did have a lot of treacherous thoughts in those days. I thought a lot about, I've gone in depth in previous videos to you about the essence of my, psychology and my nihilism. But very particular thoughts that could happen on occasion might be, a lot of thoughts about death, a lot of thoughts about like going nowhere in life, heading nowhere, and not for any reason other than fate, right? Because I told you I was also a determinist. So just this feeling like, here I am, there's a lot of negative feelings I'm experiencing, and that's just what it is. And, so don't get too close to me, because there's just this awful fate and these awful feelings. And the deeper you look into me, the closer you're going to get to the darkness and the negativity and the awful feelings, right? And he goes on to sing a little bit later, don't want to let you down, but I am hellbound. Though this is all for you, don't want to hide the truth. I think about a lot of the fights that I caused. And I try not to get too particular without being too vague at the same time. It's always really difficult, isn't it, when we tell a true story, do something memoiristic, because you have to protect other people's privacy. Perhaps you even want to protect your own privacy too, and not expose yourself overly. I was an emotional wreck in those days, so I cried a lot. And I talked to you about how I went through this depression, and had this idea that romantic love was really feelings based, and so supposed to consist of like just a lot of attention and compliments, I guess, and yet not like really much substance, really. So I just remember getting really angry when it would be like, I don't know if I'm even remembering this right, to tell you the truth, something along the lines of it being like really late at night and being at her condo and her saying like, I think it's time you should probably go now, and me thinking, but I don't want to, and thinking like, you're not committed enough to the depths of this relationship, and causing this scene about it. And I just remember something to the extent of her observation that, you always act like this is going to be the last time you're ever going to see me. And me saying something to the extent of like, well, we could die at any moment. And so we have to live every moment like it's our last. And, her saying, well, that's like a really awful way to think about things. And I'm not sure that I really want to live with things thought of in that way. That's very depressing. And I don't really remember how things got to such a point where we were literally like arguing all the time. But I know that was like a major theme, if you will. And I remember it being mostly me, though, that was always somehow like, I don't know, unsatisfied with something, or it was always me that was always complaining about something or criticizing something. I mean, that's how I remember it. But going back to this whole don't want to let you down, but I am hellbound, I think it was this sense of like, I really did want to be in a relationship, and I really did want to be a good boyfriend, whatever that was supposed to be, and not cause her or pain or conflict, but it was inevitable for me, right? But I am hellbound, though this is all for you, right? Though, so like, even though I am hellbound and I am just, it's my fate to have these sort of weird psychological complaints and problems and negativity, all of which is being, thrusted upon you. I can't hide it, right? Don't want to hide the truth. So it's this strange conflict of like wanting to be honest and real and in a relationship, when at the same time there's a difference between being honest and real and coping with what is honest and real about you. So even if I'm thrusting all this, let's just call it negativity in general, if I'm thrusting all this negativity upon her, that's not enough to say, oh, well, I'm real about the fact that I'm a negative person, right? You have to address those negative aspects. But obviously I wasn't going to have any of that. It's not like I wanted to seek out any kind of like, therapy or guidance, or I wasn't going to school. I was not doing anything in life that would constitute like taking care of myself, other than the fact that I worked a job. I worked various jobs. Totally different conversation. Moving on then, he says, no matter what we breed, we are still made of greed. Just that cynicism. And then he says, they say it's what you make. I say it's up to fate. It's woven in my soul. I need to let you go. That puts it all really well, because I think she was not so much of a fatalist. I remember one of the themes of our, now that it sort of is coming back to me, I do remember one of the another basic theme of our conflicts was the fact that I was kind of a pessimist in a weird way. Even if I had a sort of like long-term optimism, or even if I thought like it's my hope to just try and like live in that be to a certain degree, with some, I remember, like, to give you a sort of mini portrait here of what my attitude was like in terms of like trying to be that peaceful hippie type guy in a way. I can remember, I may have told you in another video, I worked one job very briefly, like maybe 6 days, something like that, maybe only 3, and I quit, and I never was assertive in trying to get my paycheck for those 2 days. I had this attitude of like, well, fuck it, I don't really care. That was then, and this is now, and I don't care about money. And, the girlfriend I had was, rather troubled by the fact that I wasn't, standing up for myself and doing something as self-constructive as collecting pay I was entitled to. I mean, that's how sort of self-negligent I was, even if the intention was actually to be sort of like hippie-ish and peaceful and not tainted by money or something. But I mean, I was actually like almost like a masochist in that way. But it would manifest ultimately in more of a depressive, negative thing. There was this other example of going rollerblading, and she could rollerblade, I could not. And I didn't want to learn, and I didn't want to try, and having to spend X amount of time doing the rollerblading like pissed me off, and I grumbled the entire time and made no attempt to have any sense of like feeling good about it. I wasn't a, I wasn't a good sport. I wasn't an uplifting presence about it. I didn't like the fact that there were parents around. That was a big one. Because I, at that time, had such a irrational resentment towards pretty much my entire family, my parents included. For me, I wanted to relate to someone who was like that as well, and so while she enjoyed a certain closeness with her parents, I didn't like that, and I hated any time we had to spend time with her and her parents. And I hated how she was often not rebellious enough against her parents. And I don't remember like any specific conversations, but I just remember like really wanting her to rebel, really wanting her to show her parents that they couldn't tell her what to do and that they weren't part of her life. And like an awful view of family I had at that time. Awful. It makes me sick. It makes me absolutely sick, nauseous to remember that. But it is the fact of the matter. And I'd tell you one more thing I remember. It was New Year's Eve, and we were eating at this, I guess you would call it like a fancy beachfront restaurant. And I was looking at the menu, and just about everything there was like mad expensive. And looking at the cost of the things on the menu, I just started to sob right there. You know, her parents were there, her sister might have been there, her sister's boyfriend might have been there too. And I just started to sob thinking about like, these prices are outrageous and there's so many people who could never afford this. And oh my God, they were such awful, gluttonous, evil people for having the audacity to waste so much money on food. And I don't remember if I actually articulated it and spoiled the evening by saying it, but I know that I was feeling it. So like I'm just like this dark vibe all the time, you know? And so, you know, they say it's what you make, I say it's up to fate. It's woven in my soul. So I'm just this dark presence all the time, but the fact is I don't see another way. To me, it's just inevitably who I am. And it is what it is, what it is, what it is. And, you know, it's woven into my soul. And so that last point, like, I need to let you go. One of the most awful realities of this whole, you know, relationship that defines so much of my memory of South Beach is that it seemed quite inevitable to me that it was going to end all the time. I remember talking about songs, right? There was a song I heard on the radio all the time at the various jobs I would work at. I heard the song so much that the song would like continue to play in my mind as I would walk to and from wherever I was living in South Beach at the time, from work to there and back. The song would play over and over in my mind. You know that song Over My Head by the Fray that would play. And just this, every time I would hear that song, I would see her face, and I would see her face like sad, and I would see the eventual end of that relationship and think that somehow I just had this feeling that there was somebody else, and that this wasn't the way a relationship was supposed to be somehow. Well, I'm not pro intuition, but it would turn out there is somebody else. So now a happily married fellow, and you know, if you were a mystical person, you could argue that I was conceptualizing via psychic visions the subconscious of my future wife Ashley, right? Though one doesn't need to overcomplicate it. Anyway, that song, to this day, just like the Demons by Imagine Dragons haunts me, so does Over My Head by the Fray. And the lyrics just really, it's just amazing how they really spell out what I felt. You know, people ask, why is poetry so unpopular? Let's keep in mind, poetry as such is as popular as it's ever been, but academic poetry is not popular. A lot of poetry in books is not popular, but songs, ladies and gentlemen, are or tend to be the popular poetry of the 20th century. And there may be reasons for that, more than we necessarily want to say right now. But as evidenced by the fact that I'm citing more song lyrics here as really touching on actual human experience and feelings and thoughts that the hodgepodge of academic poetry can't relate to, per se, necessarily, so much, in my experience. He says, right from the beginning of the song, I never knew that everything was falling through. It's funny because I did and didn't know that, quote, everything was falling through, in the sense that there was, I guess you could say, a pessimism, a cynicism, and a feeling of dread. Right? I told you that I kept on sort of visualizing that this relationship would end and this time in South Beach would end, and I was thinking about death a lot. So while I had this sort of destructive way of thinking, right, very nihilistic and cynical and paranoid and all of that, in hindsight, only as the years have gone, have I seen, though, like, just how sort of awful, corrosive, and destructive those thoughts and feelings have been. So, I mean, that those words really, the more I think about it from a place of maturity and being older, yeah, I really never knew that everything was falling through. It's really well put. He says at another point, it's coming down to nothing more than apathy, right? I was very apathetic, ultimately. I told you that story about not wanting to go after the paycheck that I had earned because I was just apathetic. I didn't, even though I claimed I wanted to be this rich and famous poet, I wasn't sharing my poetry with anybody. I wasn't sending to publishers or posting anything online or whatever it is someone's supposed to do to become successful. I wasn't going to poetry readings or anything. I was apathetic in a lot of ways. I wasn't taking care of myself. If I was so dark, depressed, anxious all the time, I mean, I wasn't trying to inquire how I might get, like, benefits as an employee and get therapy or see any kind of, I didn't see any kind of doctor at that time. I did nothing to, like, check up on my well-being. Because with the nihilism and the pessimism and stuff and this fatalism and thinking you just are who you are, so therefore you don't care what really happens because what's going to happen is just going to happen. And he says, everyone knows I'm in over my head. I think everyone did know when at that time in my life that I was over my head, and that there I am on this, I'm gonna be a rich and famous poet because fate says so, and nothing really matters to me, but I'm gonna be this great boyfriend even though I'm causing damage to all the relationships surrounding it, and I'm literally over my head. And everyone knows it. Because everybody was always critical of me, and I was always closed, really, to what people had to offer me. I remember the girlfriend I had, her mother bought me this book about poetry, writing poetry, and I took it as an affront, as an insult. It's like, what, you don't think I know how to write poetry? So I just utterly disregarded it. Where she talked to me about the power of positive thought, and offered a movie about positive thinking and how it was a useful thing in life, and I just wouldn't have anything to do with that. So there I am, like, claiming to want to be somebody in life, and yet I'm closed off to everything except my awful dark feelings, literally over my head, just with that nihilistic way of being. And he says, suddenly I become part of your past. I'm becoming the part that don't last. I'm losing you, and it's effortless. I think that speaks for itself on a lot of levels. But I think the point is, through this nihilistic, depressive way of being, it is destroying a connection with another human being. And the damage it would do in the long term is that now it is nothing but an episode of the past. It is something that did not last. I mean, literally, the lyrics describe it. And that last line is one that always takes my breath away in its powerfulness and really speaking to how I feel about it all. He says, I'm losing you, and it's effortless. It was that because, my negativity through those various aspects contributed to, obviously, the end of this relationship. And it was effortless in the fact that all I was doing, right, was being me and surrendering to fate and apathy and all these things. There was no sense of self and free will and desire and constructiveness. It was just this effortless, all I have to do in an almost Buddhist kind of way is just be. And that will amount, if I just keep on doing what I'm doing, being who I'm being, it will cause the end of this relationship. I am losing you, and it's effortless. And then he says, I won't let it go down until we torch it ourselves. The way I associate that is like, not having the maturity to realize in no way, shape, or form was it appropriate, really, for me to even be engaged in some kind of romantic relationship at that point in my life. At no point in time should I really have even been living in South Beach on my own. I should have remained in college. Yet, as opposed to stepping back and having the maturity to fix the scenario and say, I'm sorry, I should not be submitting you to this. I don't have the maturity to leave. Instead, I'm just going to let our awful relationship torture the both of us until someone says, enough. Mercy. I can't take it anymore. We're done, right? I won't let it go until we torch it ourselves. So those are two songs that really depict the way that I feel about South Beach, my time there, and how the irony of thinking, at the beginning that I was moving to be a better person and live this better life, and all I did was, mostly leave myself with nightmares, bad feelings, and songs that give me the bad kind of chills. Additional context here. All the while, I think I'm this tragic, starving artist, and my heroes have become at this point, and I'll talk to you in the next video, I think, about the relationship between some of the heroes or people that I look up to and how they've influenced the move to South Beach. And eventually, actually, finally, leaving South Beach, a much more uplifting topic, actually, will also be part of the next thing, and how that influence of other artists and philosophers and how they shape the future of my sense of place as it evolves into South Beach and out of South Beach. But briefly, you should know I'd evolved really from a sort of Bob Dylan, Jim Morrison, John Lennon, Paul Simon obsession, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg obsession, into essentially I was obsessed at this point with Rimbaud and Baudelaire. Now, these two poets are extraordinarily dark, awfully, unpleasantly, brutally dark, especially Rimbaud. Rimbaud's so dark, he was so jaded in the few years of his revered poetry that I think by the time he was 30, he would never write another poem again. I did write down one line, well, two brief lines from Rimbaud that you got to keep in mind. I, in a way, idolized Rimbaud and wanted to be like Rimbaud. And he wrote these two things in the beginning of his poem, en saison d'enfer. I don't know if I pronounced it properly. Season in hell. He says, I managed to make every trace of human hope vanish from my mind. Bad luck was my god. I mean, think about that, though. I managed to make every trace of human hope vanish from my mind. In other words, the guy purged himself of any bright way of thinking, any uplifting, encouraging way of thinking. He was a pessimist. I guess, I don't know to the extent that he was inspired by Schopenhauer, but it reminds me of Schopenhauer. Bad luck was my god. Again, connect this to the fact that I told you I was a depressed person, a nihilistic person, a negative person. And so was Rimbaud. And by the way, Rimbaud was utterly destitute, right? Him and his male lover, the other poet, Verlaine, Paul Verlaine, I mean, they ran about in the wilderness writing poems with each other. They lived like vagrants for a time. And this to me was utterly romantic. Utterly romantic. And I was in love with Baudelaire. And Baudelaire was this guy who was stoned out of his mind all the time on opium, who I believe had some kind of venereal disease, and so couldn't ever really be intimate with a woman, and was nonetheless obsessed with this woman who was, I think, a prostitute. Obsessed with her, but couldn't have her, and allowed it to torture him. And he was always in this state of depression. And God, if you read his stuff, it will make you not feel good throughout the day. He's one of those people, I think he's very ironic, because he's actually a very good writer. What he writes will effectively make you feel, but it's not a pleasant feeling. And so these are the kinds of people that I'm idolizing, the vagrants, the opium smokers, the pessimists. And it's sad, because if you go back to when I was in high school, right, one of the few influences I haven't really talked to you about who were paramount, especially to my view my launching view of self as a poet, was the Bee Gees. And, also inspired a sense of romantic thinking, something I hadn't talked about in the last video. It slipped my mind. To go from the uplifting view of romance that comes with the Bee Gees to Rimbaud and Baudelaire. I mean, that's just the utter manifestation of depression and pessimism and nihilism and these kinds of things. And again, it shredded apart this romantic relationship I had, and my economic life as well, and just relationships I had with people. And so I was living this awful, miserable life in South Beach, and it is what it is. But I would eventually leave. And I will talk about, again, the leaving South Beach, and some of the people more so who were inspiring my thinking a little bit prior to, during, and after that, and how that relates to how I would evolve my views of what it means to move someplace better. So I'll talk to you later. Have a great day. Bye.